The date we typically give to the end of Reconstruction is 1877. In that year, the presidential election between the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and his Democratic rival Samuel J. Tilden was undecided because results in certain states were disputed. There is a common belief among historians, although we have no definitive proof, that Hayes agreed to withdraw troops from the South and permit the restoration of white control in the South in exchange for Southern Democrats in the legislature supporting him in this dispute. Following this withdrawal, the removal of black civil rights in the South was precipitous. Through violence and fraud, so-called redeemers brought black voting in the South mostly to an end by the close of the 19th century. This enabled Southern governments and localities to establish the system of Jim Crow racial segregation that would last until the mid-20th century. But this change didn't come overnight. By the time that Hayes struck this ostensible bargain, the ability of the federal government to enforce black civil rights had already been significantly eroded in the South, and so had the power and popularity of radical Republicans and their plan of radical Reconstruction. If Hayes indeed did make this bargain, he probably wouldn't have been willing to make it if he didn't already believe that radical Reconstruction was a lost cause and that the North no longer supported it. So what changed? Two critical factors were perceived corruption within Republican governments and violent resistance to Reconstruction in the South. A third factor, emphasized especially by the historian W.E.B. Du Bois and reiterated by successors like Eric Foner, was the changing political attitudes of the emerging northern elite in response to class conflict and economic problems. Let's discuss each of these factors in turn. Ulysses S. Grant, a heroic general in the Union Army, is often remembered as leading one of the most corrupt presidential administrations in American history when he followed Andrew Johnson to the presidency. He was also a major supporter of radical Reconstruction, far more so than Johnson had been. So to the extent that radical Reconstruction became identified with Grant and his administration, many Northerners started to find more credible Southern claims that the radical Republican governments in the South were hopelessly corrupt. As Du Bois wrote, "When, therefore, the conscience of the United States attacked corruption, it at the same time attacked in the Republican Party the only power that could support democracy in the South." Grant wasn't necessarily a bad guy, but he was a soldier, and he viewed the presidency through the eyes of a soldier whose loyalty to his friends and comrades was foremost in his mind. He made appointments based on his relationships rather than on the basis of qualifications. The most famous scandal associated with the Grant administration is the so-called whiskey ring. This was a scheme in which whiskey distillers paid government agents bribes to be permitted to evade taxes on their products, making a huge profit as a result. The leaders were Grant's fellow Union general and his appointee to the job of revenue collector of Missouri, John McDonald, and another Union general, Orville Babcock, who was Grant's personal secretary. Scandals like these turned public opinion against radical Reconstruction-era government based on a close relationship between the Republican Party and the Union Army. Another factor was the terrorist insurgency in the South, which gradually fatigued the North. Just as America has attempted regime change in other countries and gradually backed away in the face of seemingly interminable resistance and resulting forever wars, Northerners grew tired of the long, violent aftermath to the Civil War. The Ku Klux Klan, formed shortly after the end of the war, is the most famous of the Southern terrorist groups of this period, although it was not the only one. The Klan of this period was different from the Klan that existed in the 1960s and still exists in a very diminished form today. The Klan at that time was a guerrilla paramilitary organization entirely focused on overthrowing Reconstruction governments and enforcing racial hierarchies through campaigns of intimidation, torture, and killing. They would threaten, whip, murder both blacks and whites who supported the Republican governments in the South. They also focused on taking away the guns of free blacks who had acquired them, making the process of restoring white domination easier. The Klan was not strong enough to overcome the Union Army, but Klan resistance made it clear that the Army would have to stay in order to preserve Reconstruction. The hope that Southern society could be quickly transformed into a more egalitarian free labor system was very much disappointed by the continued violent resistance of the Klan. Finally, there is a matter of growing class conflict in the North, which moved Northern elites towards a law and order position that made them more sympathetic to the South's ruling class. In 1874, in Tompkins Square, which you may now know is where Tompkins Square Park is, where there's a lot of skaters hang out there and so on. Well, in 1874, there was a battle there between police and thousands of people demanding jobs, a response to an economic crisis brought on in the 1870s, partly by the mismanagement of the Republican government. This riot was just one illustration of the mounting discontent of the Northern workers, many of them immigrants, in the face of a rapidly growing and highly unstable industrial capitalist economy in the North. Remember that in this era, there's basically no government welfare. There was no real effective labor movement to bargain for humane conditions and livable wages. The only social safety net was private charity, unprepared to cope with the scale of need that came with a huge propertyless working class. So it was a time of intense class conflict and intense anxiety about where this conflict was leading. And in this context, affluent Northerners who had at first supported Reconstruction started to become more cynical and defensive in their politics. They were less enthusiastic about equality than they had been, and more willing to sympathize with and support the embattled ruling class of the South. It's interesting to note in this connection that one of the first uses of federal troops after they were withdrawn from the South was putting down the railroad strikes that shook the nation in 1877. So that is the sad and disappointing end to the story of Reconstruction for now, although the promises of Reconstruction were to be revived in the 20th century with the modern civil rights movement. In our next video, we're going to turn to the final chapter of this first book of American history, when we look at where the Army went next, to the plains of the West, where some of the final battles to establish American domination over the continent were fought. We'll talk about that in the next video.